Okay, we're live. Sorry for that technical difficulty, everybody. Good morning. This is Carrie Kirkflew, Director of Local Government Assistance at the DEP. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on New Jersey's climate change initiative, NJPACT, New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats. We hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy during this pandemic. Please know that our office and the department is open and working should you need anything from us. The purpose of this webinar is to share information that will help you as elected officials in your community's future planning efforts. This presentation will discuss the department's plans to update rules that will reduce emissions, as well as updates to land use rules to address resiliency in the face of climate change. Today, you'll be hearing from three speakers: Dave Rosenblatt, our Chief Resilient Officer, Sean Moriarty, DEP's Chief Advisor of Regulatory Affairs, and Katie Angarone, Associate Commissioner of Science and Policy. Each speaker will take about 10 minutes. After each of the three speakers has presented, we'll take some time and answer your questions. You can ask questions or provide feedback by typing into the question and answer chat box at the right of the screen. Once published, we'll be able to view your questions and we'll answer them. Again, we'll answer your questions after all the speakers have presented. If you have questions or feedback after the webinar concludes, you can send them to us through email. That email address will be posted on the final slide. Also, this presentation is being recorded. We plan to post it on the NJPACT website, which will also, link to which will also be posted at the conclusion of the presentation. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Dave Rosenblatt. Dave?
Thank you, Carrie. Good morning, all. Next slide. I hope as we discuss this topic that we can all agree with this premise that climate change is the defining challenge of our age. Even during this pandemic, we expect to see climate change emerge as a new challenge, even though it's been ongoing for quite a while. Next slide. Temperature and sea levels are rising faster in New Jersey than most of the country or the world. New Jersey is particularly at risk because we are, of course, highly developed and a coastal state with 50% of our population in at-risk areas. The effects of climate change present real threats to our environment, to our economy, to our public health, in fact, to our way of life. Next slide. New Jersey has warmed 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. Annual temperatures are expected to increase 4.1 degrees Fahrenheit to 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. Heat waves will impact larger areas with more frequency and longer duration, resulting in reduced agricultural yields, reduced power plant efficiency, increases in energy use, increased air pollution, water use, and of course, negative health effects. Next slide. So, science. Science is behind everything we do regarding climate change. The difficulty is explaining the science to those that are not paying attention every day like we are, as such as the general public. What you're looking at here is a chart reflecting some observations regarding temperature change. We are looking at the comparison from the annual averages from 1900 to 1960 and the diversion from that average. You'll notice that from about 1975 through 2020 or so, that the average annual temperature is above that period of record from 1900 to 1960. The projections from now to 2100 are obviously higher. What we're looking at here is, under a low emission scenario, possible 3 to 9 degree Fahrenheit increase. Under a higher emission scenario, we're looking at between 6 degrees and 13 degrees of higher temperatures. Next slide. Sea level rise. For those who have been part of our discussions in the department regarding sea level rise, you'll know that I could talk about this all day. I don't have that kind of time right now. So let me just say that this data is from the Rutgers 2019 Science and Technical Advisory Panel report, which is has been present on our website for quite a while now. We have been discussing this internally about how do you use this science? What is it? What do we do with it? Well, the first thing I would ask is, when you're considering a project or an activity that could be affected by sea level rise, what is your planning horizon? For example, if you're looking at building a home and you're within sight of a tidal bay or the ocean, do you expect that project to last beyond 50 years, beyond 80 years from now? You have to pick a horizon that you want to plan for. The next is looking at, nope, go back. The next question you would ask is, what is your risk aversion? What is your risk tolerance? If you're going to build a home in an area which is subject to sea level rise, are you willing to accept that sea level rise will have an 83% chance of exceeding a certain level? 83% chance that the sea level rise might exceed, say, 2 feet in 2100. Or if you're building that home, would you be more comfortable with a number like 5.2 feet of sea level rise, which there's only a 70% chance that that sea level rise will be exceeded? So duration and risk of tolerance, those are questions that we have to consider when we provide guidance to the public. And I'm not providing any guidance right now. I'm just providing a look at the science and at least 2 questions that we're asking ourselves right now. Next slide. All right. For those of us living in coastal areas, we know that sunny day flooding is happening, and it's happening more often. I'm within about a mile of Atlantic City right now, and the data I have is for that. In the 1950s, sunny day flooding occurred less than 1 time per year. In 2000 to 2016, there was an average of 8 times per year. By 2100, there's a 95% chance that sunny day flooding will exceed 95 times, and 50% chance that it will exceed 355 times per year. So what we can see is more flooding, more coastal flooding, and obviously worse flooding. Next slide. Precipitation and storms. This is a widely variable condition. We know that precipitation patterns are changing. We know that annual precipitation totals for the last 10 years are 7.9% higher than they have been. Annual precipitation could increase by 4 to 11% by 2050. What we expect are more intense events with extended dry periods in between. More precipitation, more flooding. Warmer temperatures and oceans provide the potential for more intense storms. Next slide. All right, so what are we doing in my climate and flood resilience group? Well, Executive Order 89, signed by the governor in October of 2019, required us to do several things. One was to form an interagency council of all the departments in the state that have or will be affected by climate change. We had to prepare a scientific report on climate change by April 26. We have that draft report. The statewide climate change and resilience strategy and the coastal resilience plan are due sometime in September, and we are diligently working on those plans. The one thing you don't see here is our interaction with the public. We had intended to do regional meetings of interested parties, 6 of them to be exact, but the pandemic has caused us to pull back on that plan. And what we intend to do right away is have a webinar on May 7th. Some of you have already seen the invite because you're on our listserv. For those of you who are not on our listserv, I recommend going to the department's climate change page, finding the application for joining the listserv, and signing up so you're aware of the events that we're planning. But right now, May 7th is that webinar. It's for practitioners such as engineers and planners within the municipalities. So we look forward to their participation in what our plans are, and also pulling from them information that we can include in our plans. So with that, Becky, could you put up the website in the comments section, please? Again, just go to the DEP climate change site and you'll find our resilience page where you can do all that. So thank you for listening. I'd like to turn it over to Sean Moriarty now.
Thank you, Dave. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So, as Carrie and Dave both indicated, my name is Sean Moriarty. I'm the Chief Advisor for Regulatory Affairs at the department. That's just a fancy state way of saying that I'm a lawyer, and I head up our internal legal team. And I think if Dave covered kind of the what and why of climate change and how the state is coordinating its efforts under EO 89, we're going to talk a little bit more about the how we're going to go about implementing some of these things. So EO 89 creates essentially a planning structure, and as I like to say, institutionalizes the climate change conversation across the state agencies. Then EO 100 starts to put the things that we know need to happen now into action. EO 100 was signed in January in connection with the Energy Master Plan, and it directs the department to enact certain regulations, or since we like catchy acronyms here at DEP, implement NJPACT, or New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats. PACT recognizes that to address the climate threats that Dave outlined, from sea level rise to increased temperatures to increased precipitation, we need to do two things immediately. One, we need to mitigate, which means we need to reduce emissions, and two, we need to adapt, which means we need to build with more resiliency. On the adaptation side, which our Associate Commissioner Katie Angron will cover in much more depth, we're looking at a large portion of our land use regulations, from flood hazard, our coastal regulations, wetlands, and stormwater, to incorporate climate change considerations such as sea level rise. Those regulations will be designed to build resilient communities by avoiding flood-prone areas, reestablishing inundated wetlands, revegetating riparian areas, and encouraging green building and green infrastructure. I, on the other hand, will focus the time that we have on our mitigation efforts. Let's go to the next slide. As Dave discussed, the climate evidence shows that reducing emissions of greenhouse gas and other climate pollutants can diminish global temperature rise and avoid worsening projections for sea level rise and other impacts in New Jersey. So the question in front of us is, how do we as New Jerseyans do our part and lead in the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What we do today matters, and the results of a failure in this regard could be catastrophic. We would be looking at the numbers that aren't even shown on Dave's charts of sea level rise if we don't act now. And NJPACT gets on at that question a couple of ways. First, in December of this year, we're going to propose our greenhouse gas reporting rule. Additionally, by December of this year, we'll be proposing regulations to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And last, though closest in time to today, by June 30th of 2020, we will be preparing our 2050 report. I'm going to talk about each of those efforts in a bit more detail as we go through this, but let's talk a little bit about what we talk about when we discuss GHG emissions. So as you can see on this slide, it gives us a breakdown of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions within the state. Transportation and electric generation are well at the top, and transportation itself holds a fairly substantial lead above all other sources of emissions within the state. You can also see at the bottom there that terrestrial carbon sequestration has reduced our total GHG load by approximately 8 million metric tons already. Next slide, please. So now that we've seen what those emissions look like, what's our goal? The Global Warming Response Act tells us what that is. It was enacted in July of 2007, and it calls for a reduction, an 80% reduction of greenhouse gases from the baseline year of 2006 by 2015. Next slide will give a little bit more context to that. So this shows where we started and where we need to go. So you see on the upper left-hand side our reference year of 2006, we're at approximately 121 million metric tons. By 2018, which is 12 years later, we have reduced emissions by down to 97 million metric tons. From there, we're working towards the lower corner of the chart, which is our 2050 limit, which is 24 million metric tons. It's a long road, but over the next 30 years, we're going to get there. How, you might ask? Well, the state's return to RGGI and our focus on offshore wind will get us part of the way there. And then NJPACT and the regulations that we implement and the report that we issue thereunder are going to help us get the rest of the way. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the 2050 report. So I discussed a few slides back. The 2050 report outlines the recommended measures the state can take to reduce GHG emissions and short-lived climate pollutants such as black carbon, HFCs, and methane. The report will consider additional regulatory measures we might implement in addition to the others that we've already talked about today. It builds on the goals set forth in the EMP, and the 2050 report will outline the pathways for reaching those 2050 greenhouse gas limits. It will provide direction on how electric generation and building and transportation sectors can accomplish the recommendations of the EMP and New Jersey's new electric vehicles law. It will focus largely on the non-energy sectors, waste, highly warming gases like short-lived climate pollutants, sequestration, and transportation. And it's going to provide new recommendations for reducing those emissions in these sectors. The report is currently in development. It will be made available for public comment. The details of when exactly that will happen are not yet set, but we will make sure that this group of individuals and any other who are interested are made aware when those details are finalized and given an opportunity to provide us any feedback that you might have on the recommendations contained therein. Next slide, please. Let's talk about our GHG reporting rule. As indicated by December of this year, the reporting rule will be proposed, and it's going to allow us to identify the significant sources of GHG emissions and monitor progress and develop strategies to meet our 2050 reduction goals. It would require emissions sectors to periodically report their greenhouse gas emissions directly to the state, and this is going to allow us to enhance the accuracy of our inventory and help to direct future reduction strategies. Our ability to respond to the GHG issue is only as good as the information we have, and this is going to give us much better information and allow us to come up with better, more informed strategies. It's going to tell us where the emissions are coming from. It's going to focus on fossil fuel manufacturers, public utilities, and other emitters. We have already conducted stakeholdering on this rule, at least initially, as we're formulating how it should look, but we're always willing to continue to accept any comments that you might have. There will be information provided as part of this presentation to tell you where and how you can submit comments, and then when the rule is proposed, there will be a comment period that will allow you to speak specifically on the context therein. But if you have things that you would like to talk to us about before, we're always willing to have that conversation. Next slide, please. Moving on to the CO2 rule. Again, we're targeting the end of this year for a proposal, and this rule would require additional emission reductions from currently permitted electrical generating units and non-EGU combustion sources used in commercial, industrial, institutional, and residential sectors. So what that means is we're kind of focusing on the sources that we already permit. Doesn't mean that we've necessarily put carbon dioxide caps on those or told them they necessarily have to reduce below where they are, but these are generators that are already part of our regulatory scheme, and our initial focus there is to continue to regulate those under this rule. The potential emission strategies could include fuel switching, increased efficiency, electrification, and an increased use of renewables. Again, we've already completed our initial pre-proposal stakeholdering on this and accepted written comments, but through the ways to get in contact that we will provide, you can continue to provide us with information on that. And again, we propose to have that by the end of this year. Next slide. So I've talked a lot about kind of esoteric and potentially not inviting regulatory subjects, but let's talk a little bit about how this could affect your communities. So the CO2 rule, by reducing emissions, we would expect that it could reduce sources within your communities, which would result in benefits, air quality, and other to your residents. Additionally, to the extent there are combustion sources within your communities or ones that you might be part of the municipal or county structures, those could potentially be regulated. As far as the 2050 GWRA report, that's going to establish those pathways that we talked about. It's going to set forth how we all, including from the state down to the municipal level and in the private sector, can work towards meeting our reduction goals and to find the ways to get us to that necessary place where we need to be. It's going to establish a pathway. It's going to impact energy use, transportation, the building sector, waste disposal, and other natural carbon sinks like trees and marshes. All of that is going to be discussed in the report in more detail. Next slide, please. So going back to what we discussed about those major sources, I think we can all do our part. The department can regulate, and obviously, as we've outlined here, we're going to. But the real change requires action at all levels, and we've kind of put together, with the help of our folks in the AIR program, some tips for folks in your local government units, that things that you can look at to try to improve at the local level. As far as energy related things, we can look at energy efficient audits on public buildings and working to implement the recommendations that might be contained therein. We can implement LEED and energy efficient standards on all new construction. We can transition building energy and heating demand to electricity. We can implement on-site renewables on new and existing infrastructure wherever possible, and enact community energy plans to support affordable and equitable access to clean energy. On transportation, obviously the largest contributor to our GHG emissions, we can right-size new vehicle purchases and purchase electric vehicles where appropriate. I can tell you that the state is working very hard to do that ourselves. We can install electric vehicle charging stations for use by employees and visitors. Again, something that we are working every day to implement. Adopt EV-friendly ordinances to encourage EV purchases, and enforce the 3-minute idling requirement for diesel and gasoline vehicles. That will have both GHG and quality of life benefits for everyone. Next slide. So here's just a little bit of information, and as Carrie indicated, this presentation will be made available to everyone, but here's how you can get in touch with us. Here's where you can go to visit our climate page, look at the recommendations for the EMP, review the directives in the electric vehicle law, and where you can sign up for updates from our climate change folks, as well as where you can provide questions and comments to us. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our Associate Commissioner, Katie Angeron, to talk more about the adaptation strategies.
Thanks, Sean. All right, thank you very much for being here with us today. I know that it's incredibly difficult to pay attention to any other initiative at this time, but we do feel that it's important to put some foundation in place for action later. And if I've learned anything over the last few weeks, it's that the best way to tackle really big issues is together. So thanks again for being here. Today I'm gonna tackle a little bit adapting our land use rules for climate change. And our goal here, the overarching goal, is to incorporate the climate change science that you heard from the Chief Resilience Officer about. And we're going to be looking at, as we undergo this effort, changing our land use rules, including the coastal zone management rules, flood hazard area, freshwater wetlands, and stormwater. Next slide, please. Thanks. And some of the guiding principles that are helping us to scope this initiative out is the need for us to continue consistent with our statutory authority to protect public health and safety in consideration of climate threats in both the present and the future, and especially in our environmental justice communities. We also want to ensure that our land use regulations, like everything we do, reflects the most current science, as well as the future conditions that's informed by that science. We also want to encourage development and redevelopment that is safe, sustainable, resilient, and whenever possible, reduces risk from and contribution to climate change. And lastly, we know that some of the best systems are designed by Mother Nature, and so we are hoping to encourage the creation and restoration of natural systems that will assist in the mitigation of climate threats. Next slide. So we're already underway here in our schedule. We are reviewing the available science. We are reaching out to stakeholders like yourselves for input, and there'll be more opportunities to do that that I'll allude to towards the end, all with the hope of drafting rules this summer that we will propose in the winter of 2020 and adopt within a year, so by winter 2021. Next slide, please. All right, so we're asking ourselves and our stakeholders lots of questions to determine where to go with the rule changes. For example, how do we plan for climate changes in our coastal rules? In oceanfront areas, our existing coastal rules regulate special areas such as dunes and coastal bluffs and beaches, but these are really evaluated on an individual basis. So one of the things that we are looking at and could do is to take a look at these areas more holistically as one zone, one possible coastal buffer zone. Another item that is on our radar is infill development. Right now, our existing rules allow infill development in vulnerable locations for single-family homes. And in a proposed rule, we could consider eliminating this exemption. Next slide, please. Our existing coastal rules also acknowledge state planning through coastal centers, but climate change and resiliency are not considered in our rules at this time. So a proposed rule could clearly establish resilience criteria for these and or remove vulnerable sites from our centers. Our existing coastal rules also contain provisions that may be growth limiting for some areas because they are vulnerable, or because of aesthetic concerns. But as we try to encourage growth in areas that are not vulnerable, we might need to consider some flexibility to allow denser development to shift to those areas if communities so choose. And the science that our Chief Resilience Officer introduced to you predicts that just after a few decades, some areas that are dry now will be inundated, and indeed, he already alluded to an increase in nuisance flooding that is already being observed. Rules governing flooding could establish a new zone to require enhanced resiliency or to limit vulnerable types of development in these areas, which we are referring to as future inundation areas. Next slide, please. Now, speaking of future conditions, science also tells us that flooding may increase in the future as seas rise and storms intensify and precipitation patterns change. So sometimes that's hard to picture. So these few graphics here are intended to help you visualize what future flooding might look like. Here's a photo of our floodplain on a sunny day. Next slide, please. And here's a depiction of the same area flooded to the area that we currently regulate, which is generally the 100-year floodplain with some additional margins of safety in inland areas. Next slide, please. This is a depiction of the area that is likely to be flooded in the future given the science we have at the moment. And it's worth remembering that the impacts that we will experience over the next 50 years are already baked in. We are already experiencing them, and they are based on our past emissions and at this point cannot be changed. So in order to protect public health and safety, we have to determine how best to respond and prepare to those impacts. Next slide, please. So given climate change, we need to address how we're going to figure out how we're going to address those impacts. And one way to do that might be to consider redefining the design flood. We need to really figure out how to avoid, minimize, and mitigate both present and future impacts. So we currently use the 100-year storm as our starting point. What we might consider would be using some other recurrence intervals, such as the 500-year, or adding additional factors of safety to the 100-year storm. We also need to consider how best to elevate and whether or not we should be treating our critical infrastructure or different types of infrastructure differently. We already address habitable and commercial a little bit differently. So one of the things we're considering is if we might do that a little bit even more. We also need to consider how best to acknowledge that there are some uses that need to be near waterfronts and determine how best to ensure that those areas thrive. So one suggestion may be that we would redefine the wet flood proofing and redefine where that can be used so that businesses can flood and then recover quickly. And many of you, we're aware that many of you are already taking lots of measures with respect to flooding. So in the near future, you will hear from the Office of Government Relations and Kerry. We will send out a survey for your engineers or your floodplain managers on this topic, and we would ask you to please take some time to fill that out so that we can both hear from you about your concerns and also learn from the great measures that you're already undertaking. Next slide, please. Okay, stormwater is another concern. So how do we address climate change in our stormwater rules? Our existing rules include practices that are generally based on factors that will change with climate change. We use historic rainfall data for site design, and it does not really address expected changes in rainfall patterns. And many of the hydrologic tools that we used are based on decades-old empirical data. So what we are currently doing is reviewing the science and exploring ways to account for changing rainfalls in the proposed rules. And we might consider also investing in updating that data and predictive modeling in the long term. Next slide, please. As far as resiliency with respect to our stormwater rules, on March 2nd of this year, we did adopt a green infrastructure rule, which will undoubtedly increase resiliency, but we are looking at other ways to address it through stormwater management. And some of the things that we're considering are the deletion of provisions that allow the use of obsolete computational methods, asking municipalities to evaluate and consider climate change as part of the stormwater management plans required under MS4, and requiring the on-site retention of water quality designed storm. We are also exploring updating the design storm requirement, addressing basin resiliency and sizing, and increasing groundwater recharge volume. These provisions in the stormwater rules are particularly important in our environmental justice areas. Next slide, please. All right, and in addition to resiliency, we're thinking about whether or not we can incorporate mitigation into our land use rules. So, one question would be, can we align our rules with the state goals for a renewable energy future? And the existing rules do not really contemplate renewable energy and associated structures, but we could encourage responsible development of renewables by incorporating appropriate design standards and flexibility for projects like solar and wind. The existing rules also don't really contemplate green building, and one of the questions we could ask ourselves is whether or not they support or hinder these practices, and then perhaps work to encourage things like green and white roofs. If folks are not familiar, white roofs help with the heat island effect, and green roofs help with retaining stormwater. And generally landscaping for microclimate. Some of these solutions are really important in our urban areas and environmental justice areas to help mitigate the impacts from heat that we are expecting. We also are thinking a little bit about nature-based solutions and our existing rules, which are not really designed to incentivize these solutions, such as living shorelines or urban tree planting. So we have to think about how best to ensure that our rules are supportive of those types of projects. And possibly one way to do that would be to work on developing some general permits. Next slide, please. And as for someone who worked on rules before, I know that anytime you are looking at your rules for any purpose, it's a good time to take a look at other changes that you might need. So we encourage you to send us your ideas. And we know that rules are ever evolving, and while we cannot possibly do everything in one rulemaking, I know the value of keeping a list of potential changes at all times. And that list becomes your roadmap for improving the rules both now and in the future. So, climate change is not just the environmental issue of the day. As the science tells us, it's going to continue into the foreseeable future. So it's a good idea to have a reservoir of phase 2 ideas, as well as the ideas we need to incorporate into this first step. We hope to make a bold change, and we sincerely hope that 150 to 100 years from now, when the structures are still sound, that it will be clear that we chose a prudent path to invest in our future. Next slide, please. So as part of the land use regulation part of New Jersey PACT, we're continuing to reach out to interested stakeholders to start to form some work groups on topics like the flood design storm, nature-based solutions, the flood standard development, which is elevation, coastal rules. So please keep an eye out for a brief survey, and this is different than the one meant for the engineers and the coastal floodplain managers, but a brief survey that will offer you an opportunity to participate in these groups, and that will likely come from Carrie. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Carrie. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, speakers, Dave and Sean and Katie. That was great. We do have a couple of questions. First, I'd like to just point out in the Q&A chat box, Becky Hill from Dave Rosenblatt's group has posted the link on climate change resilience. So please take a look at that. We will also include that in a follow-up email in the event that you don't see it. So the first question we have is greenhouse gas reporting rule and CO2 regs proposed or adopted by December 2020. What about short-lived climate pollutants? And I believe that would be Sean, if you could answer that question.
Sure. So yeah, so both the reporting rule and the CO2 reg rule will be proposed by the end of this year, and under the under EO 100 and the commissioner's subsequent administrative order, they are to be adopted by December 2021. So we are working on a 2-year schedule on both of those. With regard to short-lived climate pollutants, those will be addressed in more detail in the GHG, in the 2050 report, which will set forth recommendations on how we're going to deal with those, and that may include additional regulatory action.
Thank you. Okay, we have another one for you, Sean. This push toward electric for heat, etc., has it been assessed if the grid can handle the additional load? Also, there is a bill sponsored by Assemblyman McKeon in the 27th District. It's A3383, which would allow municipalities to prohibit gas connections in new structures and buildings. Are you aware of this bill, and do you support it? And finally, while electric power is a cleaner source, is it cost effective? A lot of questions. Sean, you want to take those?
Sure, I will do my best. I think the questions of whether the grid can handle the, what we're asserting as an additional load, I think would be addressed in the Energy Master Plan. I'm not unfortunately well versed enough in that issue to provide an intelligent answer, but we can look further into that and provide further information if we need to. I am also not aware of the bill mentioned, but I am going to make myself aware of that bill immediately following this conversation. And I think the second question, will electric power is a cleaner source of energy, but is it cost effective? I mean, I think we certainly recognize that it is cleaner, and I think when you look at the cost benefit ratio of not transitioning to more electric power away from fossil fuels, I think you're going to find that, if nothing else, that in the long term, that benefit is pretty substantial, and the cost effectiveness of addressing these issues now will bear itself out over time, whether it is slightly more expensive now than it would be to continue using fossil fuels. We don't have a choice, and the costs, the societal costs, will be extreme if we don't make this change.
Thank you. I think this one will go to Katie. Katie, the new sample stormwater ordinance that was adopted on March 2nd, 2020 and available on our website and needs to be adopted by municipalities by, I think it says 2021. Do they reflect the changes that we're discussing today?
As I mentioned, the rule that was adopted earlier, sorry, I'm losing track of my time. I'm sure you all are, but earlier in March, definitely will enhance resiliency. but what we're talking about today is beyond what we've already adopted.
Thank you. Mayor Kenneth from Lacey is asking, common sense resiliency planning will be important to townships like Lacey, and it's important to mitigate SLR where applicable, but are you confident in your modeling with regards to SLR? I believe that would go to Dave.
Yes, I am very confident in the modeling that Rutgers did. It wasn't just Rutgers associates, it was also other university researchers that participated in the scientific advisory panel. It's the best data that's out there. It's specific to New Jersey. So yes, the science is sound.
Thanks, Dave. Dave Pringle is asking whether or not the presentation is going to be available afterwards. And yes, Dave, it will. We're going to be posting it on the NJPACT website, and we'll send out a follow-up email with links to much of the information that we provided today. And then a question on watershed properties. How can we better monitor watershed properties that are vital to assist in absorbing floodwater? Suez is not doing enough, has reduced personnel and staff toward that task, and reduced whole department to only 2 part-time staff for the whole state. I don't know, Katie, do you want to maybe address that?
Sure. I mean, that's something that we could look into offline with a little bit more information. I do think that monitoring is key to understanding the water quality statewide, as is protecting those areas adjacent to our waterways. And to that end, I'm very excited that DEP adopted some new Category 1 waters this month that will not only help with climate change, but will help protect water quality, and the vegetation protected in the 300-foot buffer will help with carbon sequestration. So it's really important to take care of our watershed lands, and be glad to take that question offline.
I'd just add that preservation is another aspect of this. I mean, watershed lands that are adjacent to these waterways can be purchased and protected in perpetuity, either by the state, municipalities, or counties, or nonprofits with our assistance. So, you know, I think it would encourage a continuation of that activity as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll just give you another second or two if anyone would like to ask a question. If you could just note it in the Q&A chat.
Carrie, this is Katie. I regret I didn't mention here with my last slide that there's lots of opportunities to keep yourself current and to communicate with us. We really want to be shoulder to shoulder with our local governments on this effort. So please take advantage of the website, take a look at the survey that is online, and send us your thoughts.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so the question is, okay, Allison will be answering who to contact directly. So I think that we have exhausted all of the questions. So we want to thank you for joining us today. As I said, should you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us following this presentation, please email me at carrie.flew@dep.nj.gov. Also, as we mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded and we will be posting it on the NJPACT website, which is also listed here. And finally, just to point out one more time, the survey information that Katie has shared, we'll be sending a survey to you for engineers and planners to fill out to provide us more information on the planning that you're doing as it relates to climate change. We will also be sending out a kind of a request for participation or your interest in participating in work groups for land use planning. So please look for those emails and the surveys and request for participation. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. and everyone please stay well. Take care.